Welcome back to the Frontier Faith Podcast. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jeff, and today we have another special episode where we have another guest with us, Alex from the congregation here in the Valley. Thanks for being on with us, Alex.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you guys having me on.
So, Alex, you are a lieutenant colonel commander in the military, and so we are thrilled for you to be our second guest here on the show. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you've come to have the faith that you have today?
All right. Well, thanks, Mike. I was fortunate to grow up in a Christian family, as I think both of you guys were, if I'm not mistaken. And so I grew up going to church, and that was pretty normal for me. You know, both my granddads were preachers and moved around the country and planted churches and preached for years and years. And so that was something I grew up in and was very normal to me. And so I think we all kind of get to a point where we realize that, that we have to have our own faith, and we can't just necessarily adopt exactly our parents' faith. And it has to be real for us, and I remember having a conversation, I think it was with my mom actually, when I was like 7 or 8 years old. And I just grew up assuming I was a Christian because I went to church.
Right.
And I think I was 7 or 8 years old. And she said, well, you're not a Christian yet because you haven't made the decision yourself to follow Christ and to put him on in baptism. And so I remember that being kind of a pivotal moment, when I was young. I was like, oh, I'm not a Christian. What does that mean? And started having pretty serious thoughts from a fairly young age. It was a few years later before I was baptized, and I guess kind of formally started my own faith journey. That was at 13. It was summer camp. I think kind of fast forwarding a little bit, I think that was a valid conversion, if you will. It was real, but at 13 you're only so mature.
Sure.
I had a unique opportunity. I went to a Christian school, and we had a position on our student body, I guess, where you have like the president, the vice president, treasurer. We had one at our Christian school called the religious activities coordinator. And frankly, that was kind of like the bigger position on our student body government. And so I was asked, to, I guess, run for that, if you will, when I was they did the elections as like the year prior, so like the end of the year prior. So when I was a sophomore, I ran for that position and got elected to be the religious activities coordinator as a 10th grader for my junior year. And there's a point to this, sorry. But I remember thinking, man, I'm going to be the religious activities coordinator for this like school. And it was kind of treated almost like a pseudo youth minister. You did like devotionals and chapels and retreats and stuff. There's quite a bit of responsibility. I remember thinking like, I am not spiritually mature enough to do this. And I remember as a 10th grader, I was 16 probably. And I thought, well, I need to start reading my Bible, and that was a very pivotal moment in my life when I picked up the Bible. And I really, for the most part, from that day forward, I've read my Bible basically every day, with a few exceptions, here and there, weird things happen and come up. But for the most part, for the last almost 25 years, I've read the Bible every day. And I look back on that as being a really pivotal point in my life. And certainly it's changed the trajectory of my faith, getting into the Word daily. And that's been really consequential to who I am as a person, I think. That was kind of how your question, I think, was how my faith journey began. So I think that's probably kind of fast forwards from the beginning up into, past my baptism into a really pivotal role. I could certainly go further to some other major milestones, but that's kind of the genesis of it, I think.
I think that tracks with a lot of things we see where it seems like responsibility tends to be a common catalyst to growth, whether that's like marriage or having children, or finding yourself in positions of leadership where you realize people are depending on you. And when you take that seriously, it's like can't help but generate growth. And so you find yourself in positions of leadership early and generate a lot of growth. I find it notable that you were in a position of leadership in your youth, and that giftedness of leadership perpetuates even to this day. And you're a deacon here in the congregation. You have 4 children.
Yep.
You're a deacon with the youth here. And so God is certainly using your leadership gift is not just a personality perk. It's something the Lord has put in you to be utilized, and so it's awesome to see. So how did you find yourself going from that leadership position in high school to then now almost 20 years in the military? How did you end up choosing a path into serve in this way?
As I was kind of thinking about that, you gave me a couple of questions to think through. I think I always had a desire to serve, something that was not self-serving, if you will. I think a lot of us when we're kids, we kind of idealize being a fireman or a police officer. I know you had Maya on recently, or being in the military. I think in particular with the time frame I grew up in, I was in high school when September 11th happened. And, I think that was a seminal moment for me and a lot of people my age where, as I was getting ready to go to college, I started thinking about how I wanted to serve and what I wanted to do. And, honestly, I initially wanted to go more into like a 3-letter agency. I was really looking to go more into the CIA or the FBI. When I was in college, I had a couple of professors that had come out of that type of work, and they really recommended the military. They said, get a poli-sci degree or a history degree, learn a language, and then go into the military, get your security clearance, and then cross over. And so that's kind of what I started doing. And then got in the military, and I liked it. And
where did you go to school again?
I went to David Lipscomb University.
So you went to school before?
I did.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're looking at potentially 3-letter agency, but then how did you end up then from that decide to go into the military?
Yeah. So I was just taking the advice of my professors to start with the military before you cross over so you can get a security clearance. So I ended up putting it in. I got in, selected officer training school, and right after college went into officer training school, and then got my commission that way, and then got in. And frankly, it's been a really good ride. I've been in not quite 20 years, but getting pretty close to that. And had some amazing opportunities, had some challenging things that we've gone through as a family, but frankly, it's been a fantastic life for us, and really wouldn't change anything about it. It's been really good for us.
Did anybody in your family serve in the military? Did you have that experience growing up?
Not really. No, I grew up in an area of the country that didn't have any military bases really anywhere close.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody in my immediate family was in the military. I did have a cousin that joined right about the same time that I did. And we kind of bounced some ideas back and forth. He went through kind of a different path, but ended up in a similar place to me. But he was actually a couple of years younger than me. So, very, very little. I got married in college, so I was married before I joined the military. And it's kind of funny, in the military, we say a lot of times that she knew what she was signing up for, talking about her spouses. But in my case, Leah didn't know what she was signing up for. We got married before I decided to join the military. But I forgot where I was going with that.
What was that like when you told her?
She was part of the conversation the whole time.
Sure.
I guess where I was going at, she had some military in her family. Her granddad was in the military.
Mm-hmm.
We have some distant, great aunts and uncles and stuff like that, but nobody in my family in particular.
How many times have you moved in the last 20 years?
Oh boy, Mike, you should ask me this ahead of time. I think at one point we lived in 13 houses in 13 years.
Oh, wow.
I think we're probably around 15 houses in 17 years.
Yeah,
something like that. A couple of those are self-inflicted. There's a couple of assignments where we moved in the middle of the assignment to go to a different house, or
on average, it's like moving every 14, 15 months.
It's less than a year and a half.
So you know how to pack a box.
Oh yeah. We've lived out of suitcases for. Me and Leah were actually talking about this the other night. There was one point where I lived out of a suitcase for. I think it was over a year. It's about 14 months or something. I lived out of a suitcase.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how has, you've lived in multiple countries, you've traveled so much through this. How has from what I've gathered talking to other service members there's often a spiritual challenge in being in the military and being in that environment. So for you and your family, what have been some of the strengths and struggles of coming up with almost 20 years, 14 moves, or 17 moves now, and everything that comes with that. What are some strengths and struggles of being a Christian in the military?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is, like I said, we got married real young. My first duty station out of my officer training school, which is just a few months, we're down in Florida, and we were blessed to be part of a really, really strong congregation. And, as a young couple, we learned a lot from them, and it was a phenomenal place to be as a young married couple. Really great eldership, and just a really strong church that was really good for us. We kind of, we started our family there. We had our first kid, and then we moved over to Germany. We were in a pretty remote location in Germany. A lot of times you move in the military, you get like a welcome package ahead of time, or you go to a website, it has all this information, about stuff to do in the local area.
And the military provides that?
Yeah, usually. It's different everywhere you go, but this base in particular had a pretty robust welcome package, and they had that there was a Church of Christ that met on the base there, and so we thought, well, this is great. We got over there, and
we should do welcome packages for the congregation. We should just have preloaded welcome packages for Alaska. Anyways, continue. It's a great idea.
So anyway, we moved over there, brand new kid and relatively new marriage, and got over there, and the church had been disbanded a couple of years prior.
Oh, wow.
And so we showed up there knowing we were going to be there for 3.5 years, and within about 72 hours of being there, we realized there was no church. And certainly there were some other, I guess, kind of other denominational options, but things that were outside of our comfort zone as far as some of the things and doctrines that they espoused. And I don't mean to, tear any of that down, just things that we weren't comfortable with our understanding of Scripture. And so that was pretty difficult, as a young husband, as a young father, in a remote place. We were not on a U.S. base, so we had very limited support.
And you're in your early 20s?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
Very, very early 20s. And so we ended up just kind of really searching around. I mean, we were going around, I think we looked at churches in 4 different countries. We got to the point where we were, probably the best option we found was it took us 3.5 hours to get there, and then it took us 6 hours to get home. So it was a long Sunday with a 6-month.
Wow.
Whoa.
In another country?
That one was in the same country as us, but we ended up going to a nice congregation in the Netherlands. And they were a great church, great, fairly small congregation, but it was decent size and really good people.
Wait, just for helping me paint the picture, you were still stationed in Germany, but you would drive to the Netherlands to go to church.
It's not quite as bad as it sounds.
And it was a 3-hour drive?
No, the 3-hour drive was a different church in Germany on the other side, like further away in Germany, but we drove about an hour each way.
But you crossed country lines to go to...
Yeah.
Okay.
So we did that. We drove into the Netherlands, and it was a good congregation, but it was just difficult with the language barrier, with having a little kid in the car, back and forth, and then we added 2 more kids while we were there, so we had 3 little kids in the car, driving back and forth. And that was kind of at the apex of my career as far as deployments. So I was gone a lot. So I was expecting my wife, to drive an hour there, an hour back with 3 little kids. So why go to a church that she couldn't speak the language in?
Why didn't you just stay home?
I think that would have been a lot different. We probably would have had a different calculus had technology been better. With all the churches that are streaming now, we might have considered that more. That frankly wasn't an option that we were aware of back then. I don't know if it was an option at all. But I guess the point that is probably important to make is that, we, as a young family, especially as a young father and a husband, I had to make a very deliberate decision what our priority was.
Right.
And it was not easy, to be completely honest.
Yeah.
In addition to driving over there, which was a lot just logistically, and you guys have kids and young kids, you know how that goes. But because of the language barrier, there's a lot of stuff we just didn't understand. Normally they were pretty good. They would do class in English and then the assembly in Dutch or vice versa. So we would get some of it, and they all spoke English, of course. I think 95% of the Dutch speak English pretty fluently. So as far as relationally, it was not bad. But as a father, I took my role, to bring up my children and the training and instruction of the Lord seriously, and I really had to buckle down and get to
Wow.
So we did a lot in the home to kind of augment that. And I think it's been something that's been really positive to us because I felt like I had to step up to the plate. It was my time to really do that. And so we um, really kind of began the family culture of studying the word in our home and,
Mm-hmm.
having devotionals in the home. That's something we do, for the most part every day and continue to do, every once in a while. I'd say maybe 330 days a year. There's a few days it's just too much, we're just beat. But that's been a pretty pivotal point in our life,
Wow.
being so separated and having to kind of deal with the struggle of being so isolated, if you will. So I think I kind of answered your question, but I
Well,
probably didn't quite get there.
no, you did. I mean, there's a lot of stories of folks going into the military, and maybe they have intentions to take their faith seriously, but then, I mean, when they're faced with those sort of challenges that you're faced with, they're like, oh, it's easier, even without technology, it's easier to just stay home and maybe just disconnect altogether. Or maybe I'll pick it up on the next tour, or the next deployment or whatever. So that you're talking about jumping in the deep end when you're a teenager, rising to leadership. That's a whole other way of rising to leadership. When you become a father and a husband and then a father, you have to like, okay, I'm gonna take this seriously, and it's impressive.
So yeah, your family's tenacity to pursue fellowship is really inspiring to me, and seems like that tenaciousness to have that connection was there, but it went nuclear when you had kids, from what was gathering from what you've said. So it's like layers of responsibility of your own faith and also trying to then lead your family. And so the with being in the military, with being in military culture, because there's a lot more to being in the military than just moving around a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So how have you been strengthened or burdened by being in this role, which, there's times when you clock in for it, but it's your commitment is much more than a 9 to 5 role. So how has being in this position, which is more than just a career, there's a lot of umbrella with your lifestyle. So how has being in this leadership role, this command role, and the longevity of it, how has that been used to grow and test your faith?
That's a big question, Mike.
That's what I'm here for.
Certainly I haven't been a commander very long. That's something that, it takes several years to kind of work into that role. So looking over the totality of my career, my answer to your question probably be a little bit different. Certainly faced different challenges throughout my career. A commander, we have certain restrictions, I guess, if you will, about kind of proselytizing. Like I can't just get up and preach, necessarily. But what I try to do is I try to take the faith that I do have that is, saturates, I hope, every part of my being and my character. I'm certainly not perfect, but and I try to live that out on a daily basis. And one thing I do, I mean, there's a lot of good moral teachings, obviously, in the Bible, and I try to use those as kind of instructive techniques with the people that I mentor and oversee and lead. And I may not be, preaching out of the Bible or using a book, chapter, and verse, but I'll tell you this, that, there are certainly principles that I use very directly in my day-to-day interactions with folks in my unit, because I think, frankly, it's what they need to hear, and it's what, it certainly has biblical undertones, but it's just a moral, ethical way to live and treat people, and the way to look at life and stuff like that. And so, but I would say, I think part of your question was, what are the challenges that I've had? There's certain decisions I've made I guess they're informed by my faith, that haven't always been popular. Certain things that I won't partake in, or certain things that I just don't want to be around, or I don't want to tolerate. And that's not always the most popular thing, to be kind of countercultural. I don't think it's.
Are those like informal things in the military where people want to go out and do certain things and you just kind of like socially have to withdraw?
Sure.
Or are there like official protocol things that you like conscientiously don't want to participate in?
I'd say it's more informal, kind of informal cultural things,
Okay.
as part of the military. Um, I'll come back to that here in a minute. As far as things that are kind of structural within the military, we're always, and actually, I don't know if this is written down anywhere, but we're always taught from the time we get in the military that you have to obey orders of, lawful orders of those that are appointed over you, unless they're illegal, unlawful, or immoral.
Mm.
And so
Interesting.
that's something that we're always kind of given that option, like a get out of jail free card, to an extent, if you feel like an order is, unethical,
Is
Illegal and
unlawful,
immoral.
Yeah,
is
you get
there
the
a
point.
standard for that?
Yeah,
Or
who
is
gets
it-
to decide
yeah.
the
Well,
morality of things?
So, that's the difficult thing, right? So
Mm.
the burden of proof is on the person that is calling it, illegal or unlawful or immoral. Fortunately, I haven't had to really fight through that. There's certainly things, I guess, that could transpire, or that could come up that might challenge me morally, but I've never personally been
Mhm.
pushed into a situation where I felt like I had to do something that was immoral.
So when I was, you said you grew up where you grew up, there weren't bases around. I
Correct.
grew up in Anchorage, so
Oh,
I had
yeah.
the base here, and I had a lot of youth friends going to the military, and a lot of people coming in and out of the congregation. And so when I was thinking about what I wanted to do in high school, that was on the table, of course. First thing I heard was that there was a lot of running, so I ran the other way with something else. But I just remember my own struggle was thinking about some of the teachings of Jesus, of like turning the other cheek and loving your enemies, and just some of those ethics. And how did you ever have any sort of tension when you were making the decision entering the military? I was like, not necessarily in the micro decisions about how you engage socially with your peers, but on the this big picture, as far as like the overall purpose or intention of the United States military and how that might compete with your faith. Has that ever been a tension for you?
I think it's something that, if you're honest with yourself as a Christian in the military, you have to think about and kind of come to terms with. And I think the whole concept of pacifism within the church is pretty fascinating, and I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert on everything. I've certainly thought about it and studied about it a little bit, but it's an interesting thing from the perspective of a New Testament Christian in America in particular. And I think if you go back a couple hundred years, the kind of pacifist thought within the military, or within the country, within the church, I should say, was really prevalent really around the Civil War, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're fairly familiar with New Testament Christianity, Restoration theology, and that proliferated around Cincinnati and then into Nashville, and
Mm-hmm.
it's right in the thick of the Mason-Dixon line, and so
Mm-hmm.
as the church was growing and spreading rapidly, you had this conflict that butted up, in the 1860s and became a very real situation that Christians had to deal with. And
Christians on both sides fighting, killing each
Christians
other.
on both sides fighting each other,
Yeah.
potentially, and for what amounted to relatively like domestic political issues. I don't mean to make into a big discussion on the Civil War, but I think that was made a huge impact on
Sure.
on that era of the Christian church, and so the role of pacifism in the church was very prominent because of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see that maintained pretty much through the Civil War, and then as you got closer to World War I, that started to get rolled back. It was not quite as prevalent. And then in the interwar period, meaning between World War I and World War II, it had kind of a resurgence.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we get to World War II, you've got Hitler and,
Mm-hmm.
The extermination of the Jews. And then you've got Pearl Harbor, 1941. And from my understanding, that pretty much put the nail in the coffin to pacifism within the church. There's certainly some people that still ascribe to that. But in most circles, it was completely done away with. And I think, when you look at, Romans 13, I think is where a lot of people go. And I would too, as one section of scripture that has played heavily on my mind, that the governments are established by God, and part of the role of government is to punish evildoers. And so when you look at and you're staring down the face of Hitler, so to speak, and just pure evil, and you're in a position to stop it, is it more moral to stop it, or is it more moral to allow it to go on? And I think that's where a lot of Christians got to in that era. And I would say that's played a pretty heavy role in the way that I view things. I'm not a warmonger by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not,
Sure.
There's no, I think sometimes and certainly there's probably some fringe elements that we've had in the military that are, into bloodlust or warmongering. But, I tend to believe that we're a force for good, the American military. I tend to subscribe more to the view of, we really are here for peace through strength, and part of that, you need to have a credible deterrent to really have peace, and so that's what I want to be a part of. I want to be a part of a peacemaking organization, albeit one that is ready to do violence on behalf of our nation if we have to, and punish evil if we have to. And certainly there's been some impure elements throughout history, but that's the case in any organization that's run by human beings. We're not all perfect, and but I guess that's kind of where I fall on that. Something that I think about, and but I hope and I pray that any time that I'm ever called to actual fighting or killing, if it comes to that, it would be for just and moral reasons, and in accordance with God's will.
Do you interact or see much conscientious objectors still in the military?
I have, I guess, interacted with a couple throughout my career. I wouldn't say it's really common, but I would say the character of war has morphed and changed quite a bit. I mean, we're in a very different type of warfare than we would have been from, certainly Civil War, World War II,
Mm-hmm.
And we're so disconnected from.
You mean like not like formal declarations of war, but now like proxy guerrilla type stuff?
Yeah,
or what do you mean by the war has shifted?
Boy, there's a lot of different angles I can take on this. I mean, there's certainly what you're talking about, what I would call the continuum of warfare, or the spectrum of warfare is certainly, in the American context, we a lot of times think about a formal declaration of war. You're either at war or you're not at war, and I would argue that has kind of fallen out of favor. There's really kind of a spectrum or a continuum of warfare that we're always on. We probably never are at absolute peace. With the types of weapons that we do have, not just us, but other countries, in the real sense, if we went to absolute war, I mean, it would be hard to imagine. So we're somewhere on the spectrum in between kind of all the time, between competition between us and, other peer competitors throughout the world, and conflict. But just, the types of weapons that we use, we're so disconnected. We're not going at each other with bayonets and muskets and,
Right.
Rifles and Gatling guns. And, certainly there's some kinetic options still, but most people in the American military, I guess depending on your branch, if you're in the Marines, you probably have a different view than I do. But a lot of people are pretty disconnected, and I have seen it a couple of times where, in my line of work, you're so disconnected and you're not seeing, the blood and the gore, if we go into combat. And when people are faced with kind of the reality of what's actually happening with some of the exquisite weapons and technologies that we do use and have at our disposal, it can be relatively disturbing to people that haven't really thought through that before. But I would not say it's common. I think probably twice, maybe 3 times in my career, I've encountered it. Part of it is we have an all-volunteer force.
Right.
That there's been times in our past, Vietnam comes to mind, where we had a draft, right? And so you had people that were basically forced into the military,
Sure.
and that was pretty common back then to have conscientious objectors, and
Mm-hmm.
but I would say it's very uncommon now because everybody that's in the military volunteered to join the military.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to think, thinking about, you kind of trace in general, at least within the Restoration history, kind of the movement up the conversation and how our own context shaped a lot of the discussions and thought processes for different folks. And and a lot of those are written down. I mean, David Lipscomb and some of his works, and at the same time, uh, President Garfield, at the time in the North, and the way that even shaped Churches of Christ in the Northeast, and then um, in the South as well. But that's also not unique to us. It's also a wider church history with just war theory, with Augustine and others. Like this has been a conversation for a while, and I think part of that's because you see even the conversation in Scripture. Like it's sort of what does the kingdom of God look like when it's entering in and breaking into the world? And I'm just imagining, my own small thought as a 17, 18-year-old of reading Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and thinking about the military and things like that. But just imagining, like, if I was in your shoes, okay, if we were entering into a war and we knew Hitler was on the other side, you have sort of that maybe a clear cut, like this is what this is, and but if you were hypothetically faced with hey, we're going into this situation over here, let's say a week from now, the news was dropped, and you didn't feel like, hey, this is just, or this is immoral on a big scale, like you're talking about voluntary, like would you have moves to make to be able to, like what would that look like for you in your own faith, trying to evaluate obeying God and man, and if you felt like if we were entering into an unjust war, like
Yeah, I mean, certainly, as a Christian, I think my first and foremost, my allegiance is to God and not to my country. Our citizenship is in heaven, and so, I think if I was ever forced, or if it was ever expected that I went into a war that I felt like was really unjust or immoral, I would have a hard time doing that. Obviously, if it violated my faith. The actual answer is probably one that I'd have to go to our lawyers for, because there'd probably be some sort of failure to go or dereliction of duty, and so probably get arrested. I would guess, just from like there might, I don't know. I honestly don't know the right legal answer. There might be a way to let you out of your commitment if you really had some sort of significant disagreement with the conflict that you're getting put into.
You're probably immensely more knowledgeable to this. When World War II concluded, there was like trials in, well, not The Hague. What was it at where there was trials for Nazi officers? Nuremberg trials. That's right. And they were claiming they were just following orders, but then the Allied nations tried them, saying, well, you might have been following orders, but there's a higher order that you actually failed to uphold. And it's a really, I think, important conversation for like objective morality.
Oh yeah.
And then that just because your country legalizes something and orders you to do something, that doesn't mean that permissible or that it's acceptable. So, our country currently predominantly having honorable intentions. And I'm glad you mentioned Romans 13 about the function of civilization, and that, rulers don't hold the sword in vain, and that there's a purpose to the protection and the enforcement of laws, and that God raises up nations, and nations are a conglomerate of regulations and laws and instructions and boundaries and direction, and there's a lot of people that would like to take from others, and having the means to create stability is really important for to live peaceful, quiet lives in which we can be lights in the world. So you pursuing to be an honorable soldier, I think, is very interesting, because I think it shows that the military is not just a necessary evil to check evil. It's not fighting fire with fire per se, but it's something that God has put in place to carry out a will, which eventually you can turn your swords to plowshares. Like eventually there's going to be a time in which you're not going to need to be a commander in a military. That's a hat you'll get to take off someday, which is a very exciting concept of a world without war. But right now, because of criminals, there's need of a sword, and the sword is not a knife. Like a sword is they both have an edge, but one is meant particularly to destroy if necessary. And as sad as that can be, there's also a real divine function in that, and that is a very relevant reality that we live in.
Yeah, part of the reason I'm thankful for this conversation is because, and we reflected on this with our last guest when we had Jeremiah on for someone who serves in law enforcement, is for people like me and Mike, like these conversations are in many ways abstract, hypothetical, like military and faith, So having you on is like, this is a legitimate thing that you have to think through and have for 20 years and your family has. And so this is not just a pie in the sky idea. Like this is, what does it really mean, as you said, for my allegiance to God to be primary, from the hour to hour, day to day thing, from big picture, and especially as you're leading your family. And yeah.
So you mentioned that some of these bases you would get stationed at would have like welcome packages and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever have congregations have like good on ramps for you to get involved? And have you ever had the opposite, whereas like you showed up and you were not a good fit? Did you have good and negative, positive and negative interactions with joining one of the 300 places you've lived?
Yeah, a couple of things are really noteworthy. I almost mentioned this earlier when I was talking about our church in Florida, but we were young, like I'd mentioned. We had our first kid down there, and we had told the elders we wanted to identify the congregation down there. We were only going to be there for about a year and a half, so it wasn't going to be a super long assignment while I was in training. And one of the most interesting things that they did, we lived about 45 minutes from the church then. Like we just got a rental house before we realized exactly where we were going to go to church. And once we told the elders we wanted to, worship with them, almost immediately they asked us to be the greeters out in front of the church. And I thought, sure. I thought it was a little strange, to be honest. I'm like, we're brand new. Why would you want us to greet? And I honestly think that they were like way ahead of me in like the spiritual wisdom, because what it did is we lived 45 minutes away with a brand new baby. It would have been really easy to come Sunday morning, skip Bible class, skip Sunday evening, skip Wednesday evening. It's too hard. It's screaming baby there and back. It'd be really hard just to give up, right? Just do the bare minimum,
Wow.
But I try to be a person of my word, and I try to say yes if people ask me to do something directly. So I say, yeah, I'll do it. And and they
Good to know.
And they told you, they said, well, here's the expectation. The expectation is that you're here 20 minutes early, I think is what it was, Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and Wednesday evening, every single time we meet for the quarter. And they asked you to do it for a quarter. And I said, well, I'll do that. If I have a work thing, I'll let you know, but my wife will be here. And it was one of the most brilliant things I've ever seen an eldership do, because I met the whole congregation because they all had to walk through the door. I mean, it was they had a very kind of well-developed process where you're stationed out in front of the front door. Everybody had to kind of walk through and you'd shake hands and you get to know everybody. And so we got integrated immediately because we met everybody.
Because everyone was greeting you.
Everybody greeted us.
Genius.
And it's also nice because you honestly don't know anybody.
Sure.
And so if you have people that are maybe occasional attendees, or maybe they've gone away for a while and come back, there's not that awkward, like, oh, I haven't met you before. And like, oh, we've been going here for 9 years, but we kind of fell away, because that happens occasionally, But we honestly didn't know anybody. And so it kind of, it was such an amazing experience. And it really, I think, it really jump-started our involvement in the congregation. We got to work immediately. We made connections immediately. We got put to work immediately. And it really helped us grow. It helped us connect. It gave us, a family connection. And so that's probably one of the most notable things that I felt as a young couple that was really, really good.
What size was that congregation roughly?
They had grown to a fairly good size when we were there. I want to say they got up to about 400 to 450 on like a Sunday morning, but they're, I think for the most part, they're in like the 300 to 400 range. So,
Sure.
so that one sticks out. We had another congregation that I honestly don't know how maybe we put a visitor's card in the first time we visited, and then they followed up and they showed up at our house and they had like just random things that you need when you move into a house. It was like a Swiffer and Swiffer pads and a couple of hand towels and paper towels and some basic food and, a dozen eggs and a gallon of milk. And I mean, they spent maybe $200 just random stuff that if you've ever moved, you're like, it's actually exactly what I need,
Mm.
And they just stayed and hung out, and it wasn't intrusive. They were super friendly, and that made a pretty big impact on us as well. Those are two things that come to mind.
That's fascinating because as I said, we had a lot of military folks in the church growing up in Anchorage, coming in and out, and there's a few families like yours that just I'm ready and I'm committed. We're all in. But we also had a lot of, especially like young men and some young women who would easily float, and so that's really helpful to think from the congregation side. Maybe some other things come to mind as far as like how might a congregation really quickly connect put them on the greeting team, making sure they have supplies they need. What are some other ideas as far as if a congregation really wanted to involve and to see and make sure that folks aren't falling through the cracks? Like, what's some advice you'd give a congregation?
One, you want to be a welcoming congregation to anybody that walks in the door,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I think any church statistics, any books you read, any studies you read, like that's super important, right? And that's the first place you're probably going to capture, military people that move to the area that just they come and they're checking you out on a Sunday morning.
Fish jump in the boat. Better catch those things.
Yeah, that's not just a military thing. That's an anybody thing. You need to make connections. And I certainly am not great at it, but I try to look around when I'm at church and say, I've never seen that person before. I try to catch them before they leave and talk to them, and then I try to like hand people off, like, oh, you got to get to know this person, and then go try to hand them off and say, you guys have this in common. So catching them and having a good, honest, genuine, welcoming congregation is really important. I think it's important to know, we move around so much, the idea of church shopping it can be kind of a turnoff to think about sometimes because it has some negative connotations and probably rightfully so in some contexts. But, when you're moving around all the time, you can't help but you got to find a new congregation every time you move.
Mm-hmm.
And we get really good at church shopping. You can, when you walk into a church as a military member, when you've done this, a dozen times, you can sniff out a dysfunctional congregation immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And if your church doesn't like each other and your church is not, a healthy, functioning church that doesn't have unity, it's really easy to think like, I don't know if I want to invest my next couple of years here. Like this is, they don't even look like they like each other.
I would need 20 for this one. 20 years, yeah.
If you're interested about learning about the importance of unity, go back to episode 2 and 3 of this podcast to see how unity is essential for church growth. All right, continue.
So, yeah. I mean, the first impressions are important, right? I think we all understand that. But getting back, I think, to more specific question, Jeff, is military people, like our entire existence in the military, like we're used to being brand new and getting to work on day one.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Like that's the whole point of the military, right? Like we move and it's like you're expected to perform immediately. Your job changes every 2 to 3 years and you're expected to come to work and to perform at a really high level with very little handover. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's how we're wired.
It's like Babes in Christ, but like the babe is a giraffe.
And
you hit the ground, you stand up and you go.
And we get a lot of experience doing that. One of the things I've seen is where we don't expect enough out of our military members. Mm-hmm. And I think along with that is a lot of times, and sometimes this is not true, but a lot of times when you have somebody coming in the door that's a new military member to the community, they're not a brand new Christian.
Right.
And they're not a Christian that's been apostate and is coming back. They may have been a deacon at their previous congregation. They may have been an elder at their previous congregation. They may have been a Christian longer than anybody in your congregation.
Right.
And, it's interesting. I think it's Apollos, if I'm not mistaken, in Acts, somewhere, I don't know, in the middle of the book, where there's letters written on behalf of Apollos as he's going out, I think, to Achaia. I might have the facts on that wrong. You might want to
Right.
fact check me. But, you know, I think the church could probably do well sending military members out with a letter of recommendation or
Oh.
requesting a letter of recommendation, because it's a lot different if you got a letter from a reputable congregation from their elders and said, hey, this military member is moving to your area and they've been our deacon over, you know, the budget for the last 3 years. They've done a fantastic job and his family is amazing, and they can kind of vouch for their character and what they've done previously. I think that should give the receiving congregation, if you will, a lot more confidence in employing them right off the bat.
You
So I
see
think,
Paul do that all the time.
yeah,
Priscilla and Aquila, they're the ones that wrote ahead for Apollos after they studied with him and then to help connect it.
yeah, that's right.
And you just saying that actually just unlocked a memory of when first interacting with you back in like 2017 or something like that. And when you were moving up here, I think it was your cousin messaged me because we had worked with AIM almost coming up on 15, 20 years ago. And it was like, hey, she just messaged me on Facebook. Hey, my cousin's moving to Alaska. Can you connect with them and like help them get connected to the congregation here? And so, you know, before we met you, we met people that met you and we're practicing that and just seeing some common denominators of things you've said with how when you were in high school, having that position and then the military's, well, then your own family, and then the military's expectation is how really identifying and providing responsibility for people to serve continually causes catalyst for growth. And I love what you said that they're not coming up as newbies, like they've had a storied events of service, and so, you know, really capitalizing on that. And I think that's just exciting.
So in Acts 2:42, it says one of the things that the early church was devoted to was to fellowship. You mentioned that earlier as well, just the idea of making sure we're going to drive cross-country line just to make sure that we're with brothers and sisters in Christ and worshiping together. But I would imagine it would be hard to stay devoted to fellowship if you know in 3 to 4 years we're saying goodbye. Like, how do you stay committed to fellowship when you know goodbye is coming?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I think it kind of goes back a little bit to the previous point I was trying to make with we need to involve military members early, and we need to expect a lot out of them. They have a lot to offer generally. But, you know, I've seen, you know, I think my family, like we try to be pretty deliberate not to fall into this pattern, but it's certainly a threat sometimes. And you see it a lot where a lot of military members move and they just become kind of anonymous. They just kind of sink into the background, and they might show up here and there, you know, and it's easy to do that, you know, when you're new to an area and nobody knows you, nobody knows your family, you know, and I think to your point, Jeff, you know, we've had 2 assignments that I can think of that we knew it was going to be less than a year. It was close to a year. I think one was 10 months, one was 11 months, you know, and honestly, the first time we went into that situation, we kind of went in with the mentality of like, you know, we'll find a place to go to church, but we've got a lot of other things we're going to do this 10-month period. We've got family we want to go see. We're kind of close to family for the first time. And, but the congregation that we ended up at was so dynamic and so good at involving us that it was like, we made some of the strongest relationships we've ever made in any congregation in a 10-month span.
Wow.
See, that is so right, because so as you're talking about your very unorthodox amount of moving, you know, someone could easily think of like, I can't do that. I want to be able to put roots down, like, and that idea of being stationary and is being like necessary. We look at Paul's life, his like average amount of time in a town is like weeks, and maybe months. There's a couple times he spent like a couple years somewhere, and he changed the world, and the connections he made were, not sharing the gospel only, but his very lives. And
It's about to look that up. Go ahead.
Thessalonians,
Yep.
somewhere.
Yeah, well, I
And-
mean, he was only in Thessalonica for a couple of weeks the first
Yeah.
time, right? They got
Right.
run out of town.
Yeah.
Went to Berea, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
So
And just the love that comes through in his
Yes.
books.
But I'm just thinking of how you have put roots down. You put roots down in the kingdom,
right.
not just in one town.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I haven't even, like, when we went to Hawaii years ago and you guys were stationed there, we lived with you there for like a week, which was awesome. And that's because the fellowship in the kingdom is not localized to your small town environment. The kingdom is in creation now. And so your community, you would think that all that moving wouldn't give you a very stunted community, but you're probably one of the most connected, like, in the kingdom now from all of Europe, because of you've been so tenaciously connected to the churches around. And so your family, you have a very long list of your mutual friend list is like off the charts
Yeah.
with people, which is awesome.
Yeah. On the congregational side of it, you made me think of having a conversation with a few months ago with a minister in Montana who near a base, and one of the things he really tried to cultivate within the congregation, he was there for a long time as the lead, one of the evangelists there. He said, we really just try to develop a culture of sending. Like, we recognize we have people coming in maybe for a few months, maybe for a few years, maybe they go away and come back or whatever, but recognizing that turnover, it's like, how can we utilize this see this as a positive, not as a negative? And it requires a kingdom mindset, and we're sending around the world, and just having that global scope as a congregation is huge, to know that it's not just about feeding ourselves and what can we get out of these people for 3-4 years. That's such a selfish kingdom. It's all about the kingdom.
Yeah. Well, and I think, I won't name all the names, but just in our congregation here, I mean, think about all the military folks that have been here, gone away and come back, myself being one of them. And I think when you build a strong, vibrant congregation that's based on biblical truth, and you're carrying out God's desire for the church, it's a place that people are excited to be, and it's a place people are excited to come back and invest in, and I think one thing that's interesting about the military, with all of our moving around, we've talked about a lot, is you get a lot of experiences. You get kind of what I would call best practices. You see good ways to do things and maybe not so good ways to do things. And, I think it's a good resource that churches can tap into, and kind of utilize those experiences that other folks have had elsewhere. And I think we see that in our congregation with some of the members that have gone away and come in and transited in and out. So I think it can definitely be a benefit for sure.
So how have you seen this affect your children's faith, moving a million times? And I just think about having conversations with parents who have a decision to make, but our oldest is in high school, so maybe after they graduate, and thinking about, and understandably, the idea of uprooting and trying to time things. It's like you don't have that choice. And just so, but have you seen them, you're talking about being readers, but like with your kids, with youth groups or children's classes, like how has this shaped their faith?
Yeah, I've got 4 kids, and the oldest 3 have made the decision to be Christians, and they've been baptized, and super proud of all of my kids. And I think that, the short answer is I think that they're doing extremely well. I mean, we certainly, all of us, myself included, still have more maturity and things to work towards. But I think it's worked out pretty well for them, and I'm not sure what I attribute that to. I don't want to take more credit than is due. Not that any credit's due to me, but I think one thing that we have focused on is, there's so much of our culture, and even in the military, we talk about a lot, like people want to put down roots. I think one of you guys had already mentioned that. And, as a family, me and my wife have, our roots are the church. It's not the Air Force. It's not where I grew up. It's not where my wife grew up. It's not where I want to live. It's the congregation that we're a part of, and really we're the global church. There's a global element of the church, and there's the local element of the church, and so that's kind of where we've planted our flag, so to speak. And we've made that abundantly clear to our kids that the church is our priority. I love my family, my parents, my brother. I love my family dearly, and my wife's family. But at the end of the day, they're not primary.
And the relatives.
The church is
Yeah.
our, you even see that with Christ, He says,
Mhm.
who are my brothers and my
Right.
sister and my mother, but those who do the will of the Father, the will of God, I think is what it says. And we've instilled that in our kids, that the church is our family. That's where we get our identity, as disciples of Christ, and those who are along that journey with us, wherever we happen to be. And so I think that has been pivotal in the way we've raised our kids and our family. And I think their faith development, that they're not uprooted. They're just going to a different part of the family, and that's 100% the priority in our life.
That's a great example of devotion to fellowship, like something that Mike and I have reflected on several times. And I don't remember if it's been podcasts or conversations or sermons. They all blend together for me at least. But just the idea of like the early church were devoted to fellowship just as much as they were devoted to scripture. Like the apostles teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. It's not like 1, 2, 3, 4 in like order from greatest importance to least. It's like 3, 4 pillars. And so devotion to fellowship, but what does that look like if you're moving all the time? And so that's a great example.
Having such high value for Christian community is abundantly fruitful. So it's just thrilling to see. So you've been in the military for quite some time, and from my perspective, please correct this if this is wrong, you're kind of on your victory lap or home stretch in your career and in the military, where you have, potentially more or less it's kind of like one major chapter left. Major chapter right? And so, looking back and looking ahead, you've been a very fruitful leader and man and husband and father and servant. But looking back, I have two questions. Looking back, what's some things you like wish you would have done better, would tell yourself from the beginning as you're at Lipscomb trying to sign up for the military? Talk to that young 20-year-old. Curious as what would you tell him then, and thinking about other young people planning to join the service, and kind of what is really important to hang on to. And then also, what do you see? I'm assuming you're not planning to still move every couple of years even once you get out of the military, but who knows? Maybe you'll have a very
You're
nomadic
used to it
life.
now.
Yeah, you've been trained for this. So I'm curious, looking back, what wisdom you could impart to those that are perhaps getting into a similar line. And then also just for you personally, as you're on the tail end of things, what does it seem like's, kind of on the horizon for you? So you can attack those either way.
Yes, I think, let me go back to the first part of the question. I may have to have you remind me what
Sure.
I think you said 2 questions. I think that was 3. So I think if I were to give, younger folks some advice going into we didn't really get to it a whole lot. I started to talk about it a little bit, and we cut kind of off on a different tangent, which was fine. But the military is a pretty secular organization, to be completely frank, compared to, what you might get working at a church like you guys do. It's pretty secular. There's a lot of moral people. There's a lot of people that, espouse a Christian faith. But, some of the things that are pretty prevalent, heavy drinking, alcoholism is very prevalent.
Everywhere or just in Alaska?
I would say pretty much throughout the military, and especially in some communities, depending on what community you're in, the military, that's very prevalent. I don't have any facts necessarily to back this up, but I would say adultery is probably more common in certain circles of the military, and something that you'll encounter quite a bit, and just things like, foul language. I mean, it's kind of sad that, it's so prevalent that, it compared to somebody like my wife who just can't even handle hearing, foul language, I almost don't even notice it sometimes,
Mm.
Because it's so prevalent. So I guess what I would try to encourage young folks entering the military is like, you need to read Romans chapter 12.
Mm.
It's you've got to be really clear that you are a nonconformist, because the world is going to try to suck you in. The military is going to try to suck you in. You're going to be you're going to be peeled away from your family and your support network. And if you don't plug in quick enough, I see a lot of young people that maybe grew up religious or maybe grew up in the church, that they get pulled away into these, kind of just bad influences, and so just making sure that you're aware of what the world's patterns are, and that you go into it with an offensive mentality and a defensive mentality, I guess, for that matter, and just don't let yourself go down that path. You've got to be, I tell the teens a lot. I just had a lesson for them, and one of the things I tell the teens is like, you should be different. You should be weird. And you need to embrace that.
Embrace the weird.
Yeah, you should not look the same as the world. We ought not to be living by the world's patterns. Go back to Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And I think that's something that you've got to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And I put my foot down on a few things that I was unwilling to engage in, early in my career, that were very much a very normal part of our culture, and I just couldn't do it, and I'm sure I got made fun of behind the scenes, and but at the end of the day, if you're a good person, I tell everybody, when they in process with me, I say, really what I'm looking for is that you do the best you can at your job, and that you're a genuinely good person. So like I've got a much broader philosophy, but if I really boiled it down, what I want out of you in the military, I want you to do the best you can. I want you to be a good person. We're all on the same team, and I want you to act like it. And I guess the point I'm making is, the longer you do that, you build up a good reputation, you have a good rapport with people around you. And these trivial things, if people, initially when you're young, they might make fun of you for not engaging in some of this stuff, but it all kind of blows over, and you can build up a reputation and get past that, so, but you got to have some thick skin those first few years, depending on what community you're in the military. And some of them are pretty brutal, so that would be the first part of your question. The second part of your question was, remind me again, Mike.
So you personally, on the tail end of your military journey, what does the future seem to hold for you? Because you're more than a soldier, or airman, or whatever the right word is, service member. You're more than that hat that you wear, as you are leading your family and taking the path the Lord has ahead of you. What does the future look like coming out of a career that's on its tail end?
Yeah, and point of clarification, I don't think I'm getting close to where I could get out of the military, but I think I'm leaning towards staying in, a little bit longer. I don't know exactly what that'll lead to, but I'm certainly am to the point that you're talking about, where I'm thinking about this stuff, because frankly, I've this might be inaccurate, but I think it is accurate. I don't think I've ever been able to get out of the military since I joined. I've always had some sort of commitment that's locked me in.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm getting closer to where I could get out, right? And I could retire here before too long. But so those thoughts are starting to creep in. And, there's a few things that flood through my mind. And one is, God has given us some tremendous opportunities. I've been blessed to have a lot of opportunities with education. I've been blessed to have opportunities with living in different places with different cultures. I've had the ability to lead people and mentor people. And you go back to the verse. To whom much has been given, much is required. And that's maybe taking that a little bit out of context. But I think to a degree, I'm not saying I'm so great or anything like that, but I have a lot of experiences that most people don't.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't make me better. It just means that I've done things that some people haven't. And, and so I guess one of the things on the forefront of my mind is, how can I employ the gifts that God has blessed me with?
So you have a well-stocked tool shed for the next chapter.
I hope so. I don't know if I'm effective at wielding those tools, but, I've got a few.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, I guess kind of in the preliminary stages of thinking through what God might be able to do through me. And I forgot I want to say it's Romans. You guys can probably correct me off the top of your head, but I think it was Romans chapter 6 or 8 or somewhere in there. It talks about being instruments of righteousness.
Mm.
And that's always kind of stuck in my head, not to say that we're righteous, any of us, in and of ourselves, but there's an element of like God wants to use you as an instrument of righteousness, and so trying to make yourself an effective tool and allow him to wield that tool. So I guess that's kind of a generic answer to your question, but one thing that's important to remember, I truly believe, and this is not just for people retiring out of the military, but it could be people retiring out of any sort of vocation. I might step on some folks' toes here. I apologize, but
they got 10 of them. There's some spares.
There's a couple extras.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we fall into this trap in American culture. Like, I'm going to hit retirement. I'm going to hit the button. And then I get to, go play golf and take my yacht out and do whatever.
You did your time.
Did my time, and then, I'm going to hang up the cleats and I'm not going to volunteer to teach class anymore. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that. And I'm certainly not saying you shouldn't take some time for yourself or, get out of Alaska in the winter for a couple of weeks, get Hawaii or whatever. I mean, everybody needs that for their sanity, but I think it's important to realize that going into retirement is perhaps the time you should be serving maybe the most. Most people, they've got the means to free up a lot of their time. They've got the experience, and if you catch it early enough, you've got the health, Lord willing, to be a really effective tool, going back to that metaphor that's in I believe, Romans. But so I guess that's my prayer for myself and for my family and for my wife and I, is that, whenever we do transition out of the military, that God puts us in a situation where he'll use us and take advantage of the abilities, experiences that he's given us. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but certainly something that thinking about and praying about, really on a daily basis, if I'm completely honest.
Well, I think that is such a mature and adventurous right way of thinking, because, a lot of grief and depression can set in when someone retires because they get so much identity out of their career, whether they're a doctor or fireman or conductor, or, they're this role for so long. And then when they hang up those cleats, they're like, well, who am I? What am I supposed to do? But your tenacious desire, devotion to fellowship and being part of the kingdom has already long ago superseded your responsibilities in the military. And that abundant life doesn't dial down as you're concluding this career, but you're already seeing this career as an equipping refinement of experiences to then be utilized for every chapter that God provides for you. And so that is such a hopeful perspective of life, and it produces a lot of endurance, and there's no shame, in that. And I think that is such a right way of thinking of a branch that bears fruit, it gets pruned to then bear more fruit. So your fruitfulness should never backslide. It should always ever increase. And so the thought of your spiritual service peaking is not harmonious with Christian teaching. And so it's exciting to see honorable, committed service and responsibility, but your life is so much greater than this 20, 30 year, honorable commitment that you're part of. So I think that's a great example, not just for military, but just for, living faithfully through the decades and the type of trajectory that's supposed to have.
So one question I wanted to ask you, Alex, is something that I find really important as a preacher, preaching the gospel and helping the church understand the nature of the church and the nature of the mission of God and how God is equipping the churches. It's just the understanding that God is at work in the world and that the church is an instrument through which God works to bring the gospel, to bring the good news to the lost. And but just recognizing that God is on the move and God is at work outside of our four walls, and that it's not just not to minimize what happens within our four walls, but it's just to say that part of the reason we want to have conversations with folks like yourself is to explore and to learn more about, like, how do you see God at work. And so you have such a wide range of experiences moving around so much and seeing the church in so many different places, but like there's probably a million ways to answer that question, but just from your experiences and perspective, like how have you seen and how do you see God at work in the world and in our country, and what sort of things do you see that what are some opportunities for the church to step into um, the space where God's already at work? Does that question make sense?
So I feel like I could go a lot of different ways with that. So if I go a little bit off script, then you can
Do
kind
it.
of course correct me. But
Script. What script?
um, so how is God at work through the church, outside of the church? Was
Well, just
that
like how is God at work in the world? And just thinking of the church trying to have eyes to see
Mhm.
what God is doing.
So what type of doors do you see opening and closing on like the global scale from your perspective in your role? Is maybe another way of thinking about it.
I don't know. I guess I kind of think of it from a micro perspective, like down into my life. I guess I could probably zoom out to and think of it from a more macro perspective. But I think in my life, and certainly like outside of the walls of the building here, the position that I'm in, I spend an awful lot of time just counseling people and talking to people. And um, my predecessor, he was had a pretty active faith too, and I think we've been able to, with some individuals, kind of demystify what a Christian is. I think sometimes, the military is like a pretty big melting pot, right? You get a lot of different
Mm.
types of people, and
Yeah.
I think there's a few relationships that we've made or that I've made that, I think going into it, there was probably some assumed hostility towards one another. But, going back to kind of my philosophy that I ask my team to live by is do the best you can and be a genuinely good person. I try to exemplify that myself. And again, I'm certainly not perfect, but I try to treat everybody with dignity and respect, even if, I know there's probably things in their life that I don't agree with. Um, and I think the longer that you treat people with dignity and respect that don't have similar views, it starts to rub off on them. They see you differently, and they can kind of, start to see um, not just what's portrayed maybe in the media of Christians, but what a Christian really is and should be. Um, and so I hope in my life that I'm able to kind of plant these seeds, and again, I go back to, I can't really get into proselytizing in the military where I'm sitting down and preaching, but I certainly give a lot of counsel and I talk to people and I interact with people a lot. That's like all day long I interact with people. And so I'm constantly kind of, I don't know, military, we say on parade, it's like an old military quote that we're always on parade. But the thought is like, there's people always kind of looking at me and observing me. And so I try to take every opportunity I have to plant a seed and just show them something different than what they may have thought about Christians beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's kind of myopically focused on my situation, which I don't think was quite your exact question, Jeff. But I think, and this may not be the exact way that you're wanting a question to go, but I just look at what we're doing here at our congregation, and some of the thing, like the family share event, that's a really cool thing. Granted, it's kind of based on the congregation here, but the amount of people that come into from the community to that event, or the breakfast that you and your wife have hosted, Jeff, like it's an amazing thing just to see other people kind of attracted to a body of believers that may not really have much of a similar belief system to you, but they see something different.
Right.
And I think that's really kind of what it is. They see something different, and there's a lot of hurt and pain in our world and our lives around us, and I think that a life in Christ provides something different, something unusual that's not in this world. So I'm not sure I answered your question very well, Jeff.
No,
What are your thoughts?
no, I
Let
think
me
that's
flip the script. What are your thoughts?
no, I think that's very helpful. And there wasn't like a right or wrong answer. I'm just thinking in general of, I over the years have trapped myself and really tried to limit God and put him in a small confined box to where if the world really want to know who God is and know anything about God, they're gonna have to find it at wherever my church, my specific congregation and our address and just recognizing that God's on the move and God's at work in culture, God's at work in our country, God is at work around the globe, and that like he goes before us and is inviting the church to meet people. And so even some of the things you're hinting at, I think are important that like, for instance, one of the in our at least in the West, there's a rise in the group, the spiritual but not religious.
Mm.
And I think there's a lot of that can be attributed to God at work on the move, that like this increased sensitivity to, okay, I may not believe in organized religion, but I can't necessarily like an atheistic worldview is not sufficient. And just dealing with things like loneliness, some of our some of the young moms here at the congregation, I was really moved. It was like a year and a half ago, where they hosted a couple times, and I don't know if they're going to do it in the future, but they did like a play date here at the building. And I was talking to some of them, and they were saying like they see all these moms, these young mothers on Facebook or other social media places where they're like basically making like an ad for themselves, trying to make connections. Like I have this many kids, we have this many toys, this is how big our playroom is, like they want friendships, and because they're either a single mom or their husbands are on the slope a lot, or they're in the military or things like that. And so like longing for connection, and so that was a door that opened, is a good way to put it, where they said like the church is the community, and this is creating on ramps for people. And so I think the first one they hosted, I don't know, we had like 80,
Yeah, there's a lot of people.
80
Yeah.
people there, and 3/4 of them were not from the congregation,
Yeah.
something like that. It was really, I was moved by it,
Yeah. I was thinking about, when you mentioned that, I was thinking about our basketball nights we've been doing,
So fun.
Mhm.
and that's brought together folks from other congregations in the town that we're in. It's brought, a lot of folks that are like more visitors to the congregation. They've been coming more regularly. It's brought in some families that we have connections with but don't go to church with us, and they've become pretty consistent. It's become a really cool opportunity to kind of reach out and provide, just a good avenue to have some good, clean fun on a Friday night when a lot of people aren't doing good, clean, fun things on Friday night.
That's right.
One more thing, but yeah, there's, when you're talking, Jeff, sorry to circle back on your question. I think I'd be remiss if I passed up COVID, and I think we all have probably 100 bad things to say about COVID. I was fortunate and unfortunate to
At least
be,
19 things to say about it.
Oh,
No.
stop it.
Where's your little soundboard?
We need a different editor. We need that cut out.
We were fortunate and unfortunate to be stationed in Hawaii during COVID, and they were certainly a little bit stricter than Alaska, based on my recollection, with some of the rules that they had. Did you come visit us during COVID?
Just as it started.
Right as it was starting, right? A lot of, there was sometimes we couldn't go to the beach, we couldn't go on hikes, we couldn't go on a walk, we couldn't play golf, like you couldn't do anything really at all. Talking about unusual ways that God works, our family's faith grew a ton during COVID. One of the things I thought we'd probably get to tonight, but we didn't really get into it, was
Getting to right now.
how busy,
Get you back on here.
how busy we are. Mike, I don't know if it's you that brought it up in a sermon recently, or maybe I brought it up in a Devo to Teens, that if the devil can't make you mad, he'll make you busy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of those quotes that nobody knows who actually coined it, but it's used a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But man, that is so true.
Mm-hmm.
And we fight that in my family, right? We've talked a lot about how I've tried to make church our priority, but we still play sports. I like to hunt. We do a lot of activities, and it's a constant battle to
That's
not
right.
get too busy. And COVID, there was nothing to do. We
Be
never,
still and know.
yeah. We're not big TV watchers in our family. We certainly watch a little bit, watch, a movie here and there, documentaries, but man, we studied the Bible a lot.
Mm-hmm.
We got to the
Nice.
point, where a lot of times like we'll do a devotion, we'll read a chapter or two, and talk about it, or maybe something else to kind of augment that. But, we went to the epistles and just read the whole thing for our
Nice.
family Bible study,
Mm,
And man, that is such a rich way to study the Bible because you read it as it was intended to.
that's right.
Mm-hmm.
We're so busy on a normal day-to-day basis that, sit down and read Romans or 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians, that's a long time for a bunch of kids. But we had a lot of time during COVID. And I just think, my three oldest kids were baptized during COVID. We were in the middle of a Bible, in the middle of a devotional, and they basically, the oldest three said, like, we're ready. So we drove down to the Pacific Ocean on the beach on base in the middle of the night and baptized all three of them.
Wow.
There at the beach on base.
All at once?
Well, one after another.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. That's so sweet.
Wow.
But I look back really fondly on COVID in that regard because we grew a lot in our faith, and I know other people have said similar things. Certainly, there were some opposite effects of that
Sure,
as well.
yeah.
But an unusual way, everybody. It's so easy to get mad about the COVID restrictions, and I've certainly been on that side of the conversation as well. But
Mm-hmm.
but man, it changed the trajectory of our life and our family in a really positive way, I think. So
Wow.
I love it. Well, as we are wrapping up this episode, I would like to read some scripture and say some things that might make you a little uncomfortable, but I don't ask for your forgiveness about it. So I want to read Matthew 8, verses 5, 5 through 10. And I like to draw comics. I haven't gotten to do it in a while, but people sometimes have like a template to their like face or personality and stuff, and everyone's different, but your life and your character, your gift set, I see very reminiscent and kind of a template of that of a centurion. And so I want to read this, and then I think there's some good things to glean from it. So verse 5, when he entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly. He said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion replied, Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, that my servant may be healed. For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, Truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found with such faith. So Jesus is the Son of God, and his jaw's hanging open. He marveled. That always stuns me, the thought of a marveling Jesus. Jesus wept. Jesus sang. He preached. He had joy that he saw before him, endured the cross. But Jesus marveling is something that I always seems kind of so tranquil and stoic and like enlightened. But for him to be like surprised and like jaw hanging open, jaw dropping Jesus is something hard to really imagine. And he's stunned by this Gentile soldier officer's understanding of authority, of understanding, and really his faith. He's saying more than all of Israel. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of religious, spiritual people. And this Gentile gets it. And I'm thinking of Jesus marveling here, but also you see a lot of repeating characters of centurions. Of Cornelius, wasn't he a centurion, right?
Mhm.
And you have also the recently discovered Mosaic. Was like the first Christian center of worship. It's like the 200 AD, and check it out. It's the Megiddo Mosaic, I think it was called. It's in the Museum of the Bible right now. It's about to go back to Israel, but you can see the one that helped fund that place was a centurion, and you see that several other times where centurions are involved in the construction of a synagogue or have, this active role in following Jesus. And so that body part of the body of Christ, I think, reoccurs in different Christian community settings. And I think there's very much a parallel and kindred spirit with your life and the things that the Lord has done through you of being a man of authority who understands authority and then serves the Lord in a pretty marvelous way. And getting to hear a snapshot of your story here tonight with this podcast, I think, is very not to put you on parade and celebrate just you, but to give honor where honor is due, and that you're the faith that's brought you up to the frontier here in Alaska ripples out across the world in the kingdom, and that's something that we thank God for. And so very grateful for your faith and for you stepping up to the plate of the abundant life and continuing to do so. And so excited for this conversation to bear much fruit, and hopefully have you on again in the future. So thank you, Alex, for coming on here.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate the opportunity to come on with you guys tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for jumping into our podcast, and God bless you. And if you have any questions or ideas for future podcasts, let us know. Like, subscribe, all those things. I always feel so cringy saying those things now, but they're important. So
Smash that like button.
I need barf bags up here. We love you. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.